In this video essay, I will go through the history of 3D and its uses in film and games. All of the information being presented here has been backed up with references, some of which I have also gotten quotes from for this presentation. The history of 3D modeling began in 1963 with Ivan Sutherland, a computer scientist studying at MIT. Programmed throughout the early 1960s and released to the public in 1963, Sketchpad was a computer program that used a GUI to allow much more seamless interaction between the computer and the person operating it, the user. The basic premise of Sketchpad is that it is a tool that used what was at the time a very complex method of duplicating master drawings of the flat X, Y, and Z angles into many different iterations to create 3D objects. The master drawings are the basis upon which these duplicates exist. Edits made to the master drawings will subsequently be reflected on the duplicates for the different angles. The Sketchpad program served as the basis for 3D modeling with computers, but improvements could definitely be made. For example, Sketchpad's rendering capability was very slow, as this technology was still in its infancy. Additionally, it was restricted to the MIT Lincoln Laboratory TX2 computer that it was designed for. Sketchpad was also the world's first computer-aided design (CAD) program used for 3D modeling. By 1968, Ivan Sutherland had started a 3D modeling course with David C. Evans at the University of Utah's Computer Science Building. The course was very successful and ended up spawning quite a few 3D artists who went to work in the industry and accomplished great things. Throughout the 1970s, both the hardware and software made a good number of advancements, and computers were becoming more powerful overall. 1976 marks the first use of 3D computer-generated imagery, CGI for short, in a feature film with Henry Catmull and Fred Parke's 3D work on Richard T. Heffron's Future World. Henry Catmull and Fred Parke were students of Ivan Sutherland at the University of Utah. CGI was something that had existed in films since the late 1950s with Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo, but never before had full 3D animation been seen on the big screen. At this early stage in the technology's lifetime, the use of 3D CGI was limited in this film, but it still served as a landmark in the timeline. It would only make sense that the first 3D computer animation in a film, Future World in this case, would be done by two people who were students of Ivan Sutherland. That being said, the 3D animation in Future World was only a couple of shots of a hand and a face on TV screens, and there was clear room to improve still. Once the 1980s came about, the technology that was required to do 3D modeling, animation, and rendering was becoming more available to the public. In 1981, the first IBM personal computer was released to the public and sold 65,000 units in just 4 months. These more powerful computers previously only really existed in the computer labs of universities, and now that that wasn't the case anymore, there was an influx of 3D animation being used in film, advertising, automotive, and aerospace engineering. 1985 saw the first 3D character model used in a film with Barry Levinson's Young Sherlock Holmes and the now quite well-known Stained Glass Knight created by the Lucasfilms Graphics Group. A year later, in 1986, the British rock band Dire Straits released the now famous music video for their 1985 single Money for Nothing. This particular music video wasn't the first to ever use 3D animation, as that title will go to Will Power's Adventures in Success music video from 1983. However, Money for Nothing was the first music video to prominently feature fully animated sections with fully 3D animated characters, and was revolutionary for the time. One thing 3D was not being used for at this time, however, was video games. At the time, the vast majority of games didn't even attempt to replicate 3D with their limited 8-bit graphics, and the few that did mostly came in the later part of the decade and could only manage rudimentary approximations of true 3D. Come the 1990s, 3D modeling software, and by extension CAD software in general, had become widespread, and it wasn't at all common to see people creating 3D models from their homes as hobbyists, rather than dedicated computer scientists in university labs. The processing and rendering power of computers had also improved a good deal since the first IBM personal computer, which only made further advancements in technology easier. Now that the technology had progressed so much since its inception, 3D modelers and animators were really pushing the boundaries of what could be done. On the film side of things, the 1992 Brett Leonard film Lawnmower Man prominently featured heavily experimental 3D CGI sequences that weren't only impressive to audiences of the time because of their technology, but because of what was being done with it. Another film that was released just a year later was Steven Spielberg's Jurassic Park. This film was a huge landmark for 3D animation in film, as where Lawnmower Man used its 3D CGI effects to show abstract computer-spaced sci-fi graphics, Jurassic Park used its 3D CGI in tandem with practical effects to create realistic dinosaurs brought to life on screen. Many people still consider these effects to look impressive even 30 plus years later. In 1995, the first ever fully animated 3D movie would come out, and it would be made by the studio co-founded by Edwin Catmull, one of Ivan Sutherland's original students. This film was Pixar's Toy Story, directed by John Lasseter. Before this film, there were a couple of fully 3D short films made by Pixar, but Toy Story took the foundation that those shorts laid and put it on the big screen. For video games, the 1990s were a decade of great innovations in 3D technology. Most notably, in November of 1996, the 3DFX Voodoo graphics chip was released to the public. This graphics card was able to make use of a number of, for the time, advanced rendering methods, some of which were developed by the original students of Ivan Sutherland and David C. Evans. By the 2000s, 3D animation had become much more mainstream and was being pushed to its limits with films like Michael Bay's Transformers and James Cameron's Avatar, both of which employ heavy use of 3D CGI in such a way that without that technology, they would both be fundamentally different and in many ways wouldn't have been nearly as successful. Both audiences and critics at the time gave the visual effects in both these films high praise, even if they didn't enjoy the other aspects of the respective films like plot or acting. From the beginning of the 2000s to the 2010s and then 2020s, there has been a slow but steady progression of 3D graphics in both films and games, both of which have seen a myriad of improvements over the course of 20 years. One of the biggest of those improvements was the full implication of ray tracing, in essence, the casting of real-time volumetric shadows and lights in game engines. This technique has boosted the visual fidelity of game engines to the point where certain ones, like Unreal Engine 5, have been used in Hollywood productions as a rendering engine to make certain CGI elements blend seamlessly with the live-action footage. "3D in games was once seen as a gimmick, something that surely wouldn't ever progress enough to be a convincing proxy of the real world. That time has long since passed, as we're now at the point where the same engines that render the real-time 3D graphics and lighting in games are now being used in big Hollywood productions as high-end professional CAD software. The progression of 3D graphics and the technology that supports it are not showing any signs of slowing down anytime soon, and all this happened in the span of about 60 years. That may sound like a good amount of time to some, but it is important to remember that most of the earliest pioneers of modern 3D technology are still alive.